They were only babies, soft-skinned, wide-eyed, still smelling of milk, and yet in Bethlehem they were torn from their mother's arms, slaughtered without mercy. Why? Because a king, terrified of prophecy, believed one of them would steal his throne. This was no battlefield, no rebellion, no trial, just blood on stone floors, screams in the night, and a crown that trembled on the head of a man known to history as Herod the Great. But how great can a man be if he kills infants to cling to power? And that was only the beginning. Herod was not born with a crown, he was born with a shadow on his name. His father, Antipater the Idumean, was a political survivor, a man who clawed his way into the Roman court through cunning and allegiance. But in the eyes of the native Jewish elite, Antipater was still an outsider. Idumean, half-Jew, not one of them. And so when Herod came into the world around 73 BCE, he was already marked, not by sin, not by evil, but by suspicion. A child of ambition and foreign blood, raised in a land where lineage mattered more than merit. He grew up watching his father maneuver through the chaos of civil wars and Roman power struggles. To stay alive meant to serve Rome. To serve Rome meant betrayal in Jewish eyes. Herod learned early that trust was dangerous, that survival meant watching, waiting, and when necessary, striking first. By his teens, he was trained in military strategy, negotiation, and manipulation. Not through books, but through blood. He became governor of Galilee at just 25. Young, charismatic, brutal when needed. He crushed bandits, quelled unrest, and sent a message. Order would be maintained, even if that meant executions without trial. The Roman Senate noticed. So did Mark Antony. They saw in Herod not a ruler, but a weapon. A man who could hold Judea for Rome without question. But the people of Judea saw something else. A man who ruled by Roman favour, not by divine right. A man who wore the crown of a Jew, but prayed in the language of the empire. Still, Herod was clever. He married Mariamna I, a Hasmonean princess of noble Jewish blood. It was more than love, it was strategy, an attempt to tie himself to the last royal dynasty the people still revered. But love and politics never mix cleanly, and the more Herod tried to legitimize his rule, the more paranoid he became. He saw betrayal in every glance, every whisper, every sense. Yet in those early years, he did bring stability. He built aqueducts, palaces, fortresses. He reconstructed the Second Temple in Jerusalem with unmatched grandeur, an act that won admiration from many and suspicion from more. Was he trying to glorify God or glorify himself? He taxed the people heavily. He funded games and monuments to appease the Romans. He kept the peace, but at the price of autonomy, and all the while the whispers grew louder. He's not one of us. He's a Roman puppet. He fears the Messiah. To the world outside, Herod was the great, builder, king, bringer of Roman order. But to those under his rule, he was something else, a mask of civilization stretched over a heart ruled by fear. And that fear was about to evolve. Herod did not inherit his crown. He seized it, through allegiance, betrayal, and Roman steel. In 40 BCE, the Parthians invaded Jerusalem. The Hasmonean prince Antigonus, backed by their armies, took the city and mutilated Herod's brother, Phasael, leaving him to die in a Roman cell. Herod barely escaped with his life. He fled to Rome, not as a beggar, but as a strategist. He knew which strings to pull. He stood before the Senate and made his case. Judea was in chaos. Antigonus was a Parthian pawn. Only Herod could restore Roman order. They crowned him then and there, not in Jerusalem, but in Rome, King of the Jews, not elected by the people, not chosen by God, appointed by foreigners with togas and swords, but the crown was symbolic. He had no throne, no kingdom yet. To claim it, he would need to take it by force, and so began a brutal campaign. For 3 years, Herod waged war to reclaim Judea. He marched south from Galilee, cutting through villages, spilling Jewish blood to seize a Jewish crown. When he finally entered Jerusalem in 37 BCE, it was not to cheers, but to silence. Antigonus was captured. Herod sent him to Antony, who had him scourged and beheaded, the first time a Roman executed a king in this manner. The message was clear. The old dynasty was dead. A new reign had begun, and it began with blood. But Herod's rule was far from secure. The people distrusted him. The Sanhedrin, Jewish religious leaders, resented his power. Even his own family, the Hasmoneans he had married into, whispered doubts behind closed doors. So Herod did what tyrants do best. He silenced doubt. First, he appointed high priests not by lineage, but by loyalty. When that failed, he simply replaced them one after another until the role became meaningless. Then came the family purges. Mariam's brother Aristobulus was just 17 when he was made high priest. He was handsome, popular, beloved by the people, too beloved. Herod invited him to a banquet, and he drowned in a pool by accident. Grief-stricken, Mariam wept. She accused Herod of murder, so he killed her too, strangled. His own wife, the woman he once claimed to love more than life itself, he later claimed he went mad with grief. But even madness could not slow the machinery of power. He ordered the death of Mariam's mother, then her grandfather, then her 2 sons, each death justified by suspicion of conspiracy, each bloodied rope another thread severed between Herod and the Hasmonean bloodline. He became king not by birthright, nor by the will of his people, but by annihilating every rival until none remained. Still, he smiled. He held court. He walked among the people, but his ears never stopped listening. His mind never stopped spinning. What if someone else was chosen? What if a true heir was born, not yet known? What if prophecy was real? Even now the ancient scrolls warned, a child would come from Bethlehem, a ruler destined to shepherd Israel, and Herod began to tremble. The throne was finally his. The rivals were gone. Jerusalem was quiet, too quiet, and Herod could not sleep. He had what he wanted, but something in him had begun to rot. He started seeing ghosts, not the kind that drift through halls, but the kinds that hide behind every whisper, every smile, every silence. He saw plots in the footsteps of servants, saw treason in the breath of his own sons. By now his palace was a fortress, not just in stone but in ritual. Food was tasted by slaves before he ate. Guards watched the guards who watched the guards. He surrounded himself not with friends, but with spies. And the dreams were the worst. In sleep he heard Mariam's voice, cold, betrayed, bleeding. He would wake soaked in sweat, clawing at air, calling her name like a man drowning. They said he loved her more than anything. So why did he kill her? Because love to Herod was not gentleness. It was possession, it was control, and when he couldn't control her, when she mourned her brother too deeply, when she challenged his authority, he crushed her like he crushed everything that defied him. After Mariam's death, something in Herod twisted permanently. He began killing not out of necessity, but preemptively. Anyone who reminded him of her, gone. Anyone who questioned his grief, gone. Anyone who might speak her name the wrong way, gone. He became obsessed with omens. He brought in astrologers, prophets, foreign magi. Not to worship, Herod believed in no god above himself, but to gather information. What do the stars say? Who is coming? When will my throne fall? Some said he stared at maps of Bethlehem for hours, tracing villages, calculating, wondering if the ancient prophecies could be literal, because across Judea stories were spreading, of a child born under a strange star, a boy who would become the king of the Jews, not Herod, but someone chosen, someone divine. The older he grew, the more desperate he became. He was not aging like a king, he was decaying like a ruin, his body swelled with sickness. Some accounts speak of ulcers that burst open with worms, of breath that reeked of death while he still lived, of a man who screamed in pain and still signed execution orders with shaking hands. He beat his own son in public, accused another of poisoning his soup. Even Caesar Augustus, his patron in Rome, once said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son." Because the pig at least might be spared for religious reasons. But the son? The son could be executed for a dream, and still the rumours kept growing. Bethlehem, a star, a child. The prophecy was no longer myth. It was a threat. And Herod, king of the Jews, builder of temples, slayer of enemies, began preparing to slaughter infants. It began with a question. Where is he who has been born king? King of the Jews. Foreigners had arrived in Jerusalem, magi from the east. They didn't whisper. They asked boldly, publicly, before the court, before the priests, before Herod. They spoke of a steer, of a prophecy, of a child born in Bethlehem, destined to rule. The silence that followed their question was deafening. Herod smiled, of course. He welcomed them, told them he too wanted to worship this child, told them to find him, and returned to blit. Behind that smile, the ground cracked. The word king did not mean curiosity to Herod. It meant rebellion. It meant threat. It meant a dagger in the dark waiting in a cradle. Bethlehem was a tiny place, hardly a dot on the map, but prophecies didn't care about borders or size, and neither did Herod's fear. When the Magi did not return, warned in a dream, fleeing the kingdom, Herod's smile vanished. He issued the order quietly but swiftly. Kill every male child under 2 years of age in Bethlehem and in all the surrounding districts. There were no trials, no investigations, just a number, just an age. And then, just blood. Soldiers marched into Bethlehem before dawn. No trumpets, no announcements, just knocks on doors, screams and blades. They tore children from beds, from breasts, from bathwater. Some mothers begged, some offered themselves in place, some tried to hide their babies in jars, ovens, wells. None were spared. There are no full records, no official tallies. Some historians argue the massacre may have been small, perhaps a dozen children, maybe 20, since Bethlehem was not a large town. Others say it's possible the event never happened at all, that it was a later invention by gospel writers to draw a parallel between Jesus and Moses. Even the Jewish historian Josephus, who chronicled Herod's crimes in painful detail, said nothing of this. But perhaps that silence says everything, because what is more terrifying than a crime so brutal? It disappears. The church remembered. For over 2,000 years, the blood of Bethlehem's children cried out in sacred text, in paintings, in liturgy. In the Gospel of Matthew it is written, "A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more." This was not war. This was not conquest. This was genocide by fear, and yet it failed. The child Herod feared was warned in a dream. Joseph fled with Mary and the infant Jesus to Egypt. The throne still trembled. The prophecy still lived. But Herod's soul died a little more that day. He built fortresses in the desert. He bricked up entire rooms. He started surrounding himself with loyalists and killers so tightly that no air could pass between them. Yet he still heard them. The screams, the mothers, the silence that followed. Bethlehem never forgave, the world never forgot, and Herod would never sleep again. Herod's enemies were no longer foreign men, they were invisible, whispers in corners, dreams in the night, looks exchanged across rooms, and so he built a kingdom not of loyalty but of fear. His palaces had hidden corridors, his officials had no privacy, every servant was watched, every nobleman spied upon, every member of his own family suspected. He created a network of informants so vast that no one, not even his wives or children, dared speak freely. Words could be twisted, pauses could be damning, even silence could be interpreted as sedition. And Herod was always listening. He had already killed Mariam, but that didn't satisfy his paranoia. Her 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, were next. They were educated in Rome, brilliant, cultured, popular, too popular. The people adored them, the Senate respected them. They were half Hasmonean, the last link to Judea's royal past. To Herod they were rivals, born from the woman he loved, and reminders of everything he had destroyed. He accused them of treason, of plotting his death, of poisoning the court. The evidence? A rumour, a letter, a fear. He brought them before a Roman tribunal, rigged of course, and when the verdict was read, Herod did not weep. He nodded. They were strangled, his own sons, princes of Judea. The people were horrified, but they did not speak, because they had seen what happened to those who questioned Herod. One day it was a scholar, next day a priest, then a cousin, a wife, a soldier, a servant, a son. Herod didn't just rule Judea, he drained it of hope, of legacy, of love. He turned Jerusalem into a mausoleum, a holy city that had forgotten how to breathe. And yet, at the same time, he built wonders. He expanded the Second Temple in Jerusalem, an architectural marvel. He reconstructed cities, built aqueducts, theatres, fortresses, harbours. Caesarea Maritima rose from sand into marble, one of the greatest ports in the ancient world. His hands bled with cruelty, but his cities gleamed with civilization. This contradiction became his legacy. He was Rome's darling, Judea's tyrant, a king who gave with one hand and strangled with the other. But even the most powerful tyrants cannot control time. Herod grew old, sick, twisted. His body began to betray him in the same way he believed everyone else had. He developed an incurable illness, described by Josephus in grotesque detail. Ulcerated intestines, swollen feet, a putrefying stomach, convulsions, maggots crawling from open sores, a stench so foul it cleared rooms. Some now say it was chronic kidney disease. Others say Fournier's gangrene. No one can be certain. But what is certain is that Herod suffered, and still he ruled. He continued issuing death warrants from his sickbed, continued accusing sons, continued rewriting his will. He had so many of his children executed that none could guess who would inherit the throne. One day it was Antipater, the eldest. Next day it was Philip. Then back to Antipater, until Herod had him arrested too. Then executed, 5 days before his own death. A final son, a final murder, a final gesture of control, but there was one last horror to come. Herod knew no one would mourn him. He was hated, feared, despised. So he ordered that when he died, hundreds of prominent Jewish elders be rounded up and executed. He wanted tears on the day of his funeral, even if they weren't for him. Fortunately, this order was never carried out, but it was written, signed, sealed. Proof that Herod, until the very end, believed that love, grief, and loyalty could be forced by terror. His kingdom had become a palace of graves, and soon it would bury its king. By the time Herod's body began to rot from the inside, he had murdered nearly every person who ever loved him. His wife, his sons, his friends, even his most loyal advisors. Love had become a liability, affection a threat, and trust something that could only be answered with a knife. In his final months, Herod no longer ruled. He raved. He was bedridden, screaming in agony day and night. He clawed at his own skin to tear the pain out. His breath reeked of decay. His limbs swelled. His genitals oozed pus. His voice, once thunderous in court, became a rasping hiss through clenched teeth. Josephus, the Jewish historian, spares no detail. Herod's condition was so hideous that even his guards flinched. Worms bred in his wounds while he still breathed. The stench drove people from his chamber. He was, in every way, decomposing alive. But his paranoia did not rot, it sharpened. He had his eldest son Antipater, once heir apparent, put in chains, accused him of plotting his death. Antipater begged, wept, pleaded. It didn't matter. 5 days before Herod himself died, he ordered Antipater executed. Not even death could be allowed to beat him to the kill. Then, delirious with fever, Herod summoned his remaining advisors. He had one more decree. He commanded that after his death, hundreds of Judea's most respected elders, men from every region, be taken to the hippodrome in Jericho and executed. Why? So that there would be mourning in Judea when he died. If not for the king, then at least for someone. Even grief in Herod's eyes could be manufactured, forced, engineered. The moment he breathed his last, they were to die. But the moment never came, at least not for them. When Herod finally expired sometime in 4 BCE, the order was quietly ignored. The elders were released, and no one wept. There were no tears, no laments, no mourning crowds, only relief, silence, a strange, exhausted stillness. He was buried in Herodium, a fortress palace he had carved into the hills outside Jerusalem, his own artificial mountain, shaped like a volcano, a tomb fit for a god. A monument to fear. For centuries, no one knew exactly where the tomb lay. It was hidden, lost. It wasn't until 2007 that archaeologists finally confirmed its location. A shattered limestone coffin, fragments of red stone, the body long gone. Even in death, Herod remained elusive. He had tried to outbuild the memory, outkill prophecy, outlive fate, and yet his name became a curse. Children would hear the name Herod and tremble. He would not be remembered as the great builder of Caesarea, nor the restorer of the temple, but as the king who murdered his wife, slaughtered his sons, and, whether fact or fable, ordered the death of every infant boy in Bethlehem. The Roman Empire forgot him. The Jewish people reviled him. The Christians feared him, and the world turned the page. Herod had ruled for nearly 4 decades. But in the end, he ruled nothing. Not his kingdom, not his family, not even his legacy, because a true king is remembered in love, and Herod left nothing but graves. Herod died believing he had silenced the prophecy, that the screams in Bethlehem had washed away the threat, that the child born under the star had been found and erased. But truth is not so easily strangled, and fate is not so easily fooled, because while Herod's soldiers were slaughtering infants in Bethlehem, a family was fleeing into the desert, a carpenter, a young mother, and their child, silent, wrapped in linen, carried across the burning wilderness toward Egypt. They had no army, no wealth, no crown, only a warning, given in a dream, only a road, carved by faith. Joseph, warned by an angel, took Mary and the infant Jesus and disappeared into the dust. They travelled by night, hid during the day, avoided roads, cities, soldiers, crossed into exile under the very nose of the man who wanted them dead. And so the prophecy lived. Herod's massacre, meant to erase a Messiah, only confirmed the fear he had tried to hide, that his throne was never truly his, that his power was borrowed, and that history would not be kind. The Gospel of Matthew recalls this moment with brutal poetry. Out of Egypt I called my son. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And in that verse something shifted forever. Herod, the king of stone and fire, was now reduced to a villain in a larger story, one in which he would never be the hero. The baby he failed to kill would return, not with armies but with parables, not with vengeance but with forgiveness, not to build palaces but to tear down walls. Herod built monuments, the child built movements. Herod ruled with fear, the child taught in love, and even though centuries passed and debates rose around the massacre's historicity, whether it happened exactly as written or symbolically, the moral weight remained. Because Herod's reign, whether measured in bricks or bones, was always soaked in blood. He tried to kill a prophecy, and instead became part of it. The irony is cruel. The man who tried to bury a king became the very darkness against which that king's light would shine, and the name Herod would forever be spoken in the same breath as innocence lost and evil exposed. When Herod the Great died, the world did not end. No wars broke out, no kingdoms collapsed. The stars did not happen, not dim. No statue wept for him. His body was buried with splendour, but his name began to fade almost immediately, not from memory but from reverence. He had ruled with such violence, such calculation, that even his death was met with silence. And then, a quiet reorganisation. Rome divided his kingdom between his sons, not as a unified crown but as a puzzle, scattered and weakened. Herod Archelaus received Judea and Samaria, but he was deposed within 10 years for cruelty. Herod Antipas, more subtle, ruled Galilee and Perea, and Philip took the northeastern territories. They carried his blood, but not his power. The grandeur of Herod the Great became a political liability. His legacy, embarrassing. The Roman Senate no longer needed a tyrant for Judea. They needed administrators, and so Herod's temples stood, his fortresses held firm, his cities thrived, but his name was spoken less and less. In Jewish tradition, he was remembered not as a king, but as a butcher, a traitor, a Romanized mockery of true leadership. In Christian tradition, he was immortalized as the villain who tried to murder the Messiah, the man who turned a small town into a graveyard, a symbol of unredeemable cruelty. Even Josephus, writing decades later, documented Herod's architectural achievements with reluctant admiration, but made no effort to hide his moral disgust. Time eroded his reputation. The titles faded. The word great began to taste like irony, and yet his buildings remained. The Second Temple expansion became the centerpiece of Jerusalem. The desert fortress of Masada would later host Jewish rebels in their final tragic stand against Rome. The port of Caesarea Maritima connected Judea to the heart of the empire. The Herodium loomed like a buried volcano, half palace, half tomb. He left a scar across the land, a scar too deep to erase, but too painful to admire. His name was not carved into Jewish prayer. It was not lifted in Roman ceremony. It was not whispered in legend. It was avoided. In the centuries that followed, his lineage diminished. His sons and grandsons ruled smaller and smaller provinces. Petty kings, client rulers, afterthoughts in Rome's wider world. Herod the Great had tried to build an eternal dynasty, but dynasties built on graves never last. He had no poets, no loyal scribes, no family who were willing to defend his memory. What remained were ruins, some of stone, some of bone, and the echo of a name forever linked to death. In the centuries after his death, Herod the Great became something worse than a villain. He became a warning, not the kind carved into law, but the kind whispered at night, of a man who ruled everything and lost his soul. History did not cleanse his sins, it fossilized them. His legacy, once written in marble, now bled through stained glass windows and Sunday sermons, not as the builder of temples, but as the butcher of Bethlehem. Even in traditions where the massacre of the innocents is debated, his cruelty is not. The pattern was always there, from the public strangling of his own sons, to the calculated murder of his wife, to the torture of enemies both real and imagined. The Herod remembered by the Christian world is not a king, he is a monster. Artists painted him in shadow, Cadillac and wild-eyed, pointing at terrified mothers. Swords raised, babies ripped from arms. Dante placed him in hell not as a man of passion, but of cold, premeditated tyranny, the kind that leaves no room for remorse, no space for grace. In Jewish memory he fared no better. The temple he rebuilt, glorious as it was, could not absolve his crimes. To many his alliance with Rome was unforgivable. He was a puppet, a foreigner, a destroyer of sacred bloodlines. The Hasmoneans, once a proud royal house of Jewish identity, were extinguished under his rule, not by outsiders, but by marriage and murder. And yet the silence that followed him is the most haunting. No one defended Herod, no memoirs from his sons, no shrine built by grateful subjects, no inscription proclaiming his greatness. Even the Herodium, his towering tomb, was ransacked, its contents scattered, his sarcophagus shattered into pieces. He had tried to build a monument to himself so large it could not be ignored. But it was the parts he could not control, the memories, the rumours, the children he couldn't find, that lived longer. The irony is sharp. A man who feared obscurity more than death, who slaughtered infants to preserve his name, is now remembered only for the slaughter of infants. He who erased lives to protect a crown lost the crown and was buried beneath the weight of every innocent he tried to silence. And so today, when people speak his name, they do not think of palaces, or ports, or temples carved into mountains. They think of blood, they think of Bethlehem, and they ask, what kind of king murders children in the night to keep his throne? When the crown slips, some rulers reach for justice, others reach for blood of a hurt. Herod chose blood. He did not start as a tyrant. He was brilliant, ambitious, and gifted with a vision few of his time could match. He modernized Judea. He rebuilt the temple. He brought wealth to a fractured kingdom. He could have been remembered as a statesman. But fear is a slow poison. It doesn't strike in the open. It seeps into the corners of thought, into the spaces between words, until every kindness feels like a trap, and every sentence sounds like betrayal. And once that poison took root in Herod's heart, he stopped building a kingdom and started fortifying a tomb. What he could not control he destroyed. What he could not understand he silenced. What he could not love without suspicion he murdered. We remember Herod not for the cities he razed, but for the babies he erased. Not for the marble of Caesarea, but for the blood in Bethlehem. And yet Herod's story is not simply one of cruelty, it is a mirror. Because history is full of Herods, kings who silence prophecy, leaders who fear children, men who cannot bear the idea that someone younger, humbler or holier might inherit the world. What do we do with power when we have it? Do we share it, shelter with it, or slaughter for it? Herod shows us where fear of the future leads when it is left unchecked, not into protection but into paranoia, not into stability but into atrocity. And as we walk the ruins he left behind, as we run fingers across the stones of the Temple Mount, as we whisper prayers in places where children once screamed, we are forced to ask, is a name worth this much blood? Is a throne worth this much horror? And if we are not careful, could we too become Herod in smaller, quieter ways? I don't tell this story to condemn a man who died more than 2,000 years ago. I tell it because his shadow still lingers in history. Not everyone carries a sword to murder children. But there are powers today that still silence the weak, crush fragile futures, and bury the truth simply because it is frightening. Herod was not a demon, he was a man, and that is what makes it all the more terrifying.